So, we wanted to start with the topic of self care for caregivers. I'd imagine that a lot of folks are already familiar with the idea of self care. I think it's something that's really entered just like general conversation uh, as is. And part of the reason we wanted to talk about it is that it's also one of the things that I think can be incredibly challenging when we're in a position where we're providing care for a loved one. Um, just to have a working definition for all of us. So, self care is the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well being and happiness, particularly during periods of stress. And one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge in this, and part of the reason, like I just mentioned, why I think this in particular can be quite important, is that we know that self care, or the extent to which our own well being is attended to, can help us also provide care for our loved one. I am sure that folks have heard those sayings like you can't pour from an empty cup or to put your oxygen mask on first. Um, and those things are both true, and I want to acknowledge too that when we are experiencing stress, that is often the time when a lot of the things that we do that serve us in our self care can actually feel the least accessible. So I want to normalize and name that because it's not always quite as simple as like, well, just do the things and you'll feel better. It can feel really hard to feel resourced to do the things that we know may potentially serve us as well. That's a part of the dynamic. And I also want to acknowledge that when it comes to our self care, sometimes there are certain beliefs that we may hold that further get in the way of our ability to engage with self care. Um, Depending on what we think that self care looks like, some of those beliefs might be that self care is an indulgence. I'm not naysaying a bubble bath and candles, um, but self care isn't always this big, luxurious thing. Sometimes it really is those basics of like, have I had anything to drink, like any water in the past hour? Have I had anything that looks like a balanced meal today? When's the last time I slept? Um, in addition to that, I think tied into this idea of indulgence is that it can feel really selfish. And I know that I gave those examples, those sayings that folks have around, we can't pour from an empty cup. And I know on the one hand that that is true, but I also know that sometimes because we want to give care to our loved ones, that can also feel like a hard um, piece to just kind of sit with, and it can feel dissonant. And so one of the things that I'll sometimes offer is that sometimes self-care isn't necessarily just about, putting me first. It's about putting me also into the equation. So you're not necessarily only attending to your own needs, which is, I think, where sometimes we can feel like we're venturing, but really that I'm including myself in this as well. And then the other piece is that it's time consuming. Um, this, I think, can be particularly fiddly when we're talking about caregiving, because sometimes caregiving in and of itself is time consuming. And I recognize that one of the things that can be really hard is that it can feel challenging to put one more thing on the list. Like if there's something on the list that's going to go, it's very easy for it to be something that's about us. Um, I think where there are pieces around the time element that are worthwhile to explore could include if in the past my self-care was something like, I will exercise for 20 minutes, can we instead think about, are there ways that we can break that down into smaller chunks of time? Where can we introduce some flexibility? Though again, admittedly, challenging to do to be flexible during a time when your resources to be flexible are somewhat limited. Um, I think one of the challenges in this too is that sometimes these beliefs can certainly kind of create this situation that can also lead us into feeling quite guilty um, when we do feel like we need to take time for ourselves, when our resources are feeling low. Um, and I think that can be one of the compelling and challenging reasons why it's hard to engage in self-care. I don't know if anyone is already familiar with the idea of self-compassion. But that is something that I wanted to offer as a thought and a potential practice, as a way to kind of sit with that guilt and to offer it a little bit of kindness and tenderness. And so, self compassion, a lot of the work around that comes from Dr. Kristen Neff. If you Google self compassion and her name, her website will come up. Um, I appreciate this sort of framework that she gives that with self compassion, we give ourselves the same kindness and support we'd give to a good friend. So essentially, it is, being aware of how we're feeling, um, whether it be some of those like, oh, I shouldn't need to take the time to do this, or I shouldn't be feeling so tired about this. Taking those thoughts, one, having them in your awareness, two, treating them with kindness, and three, recognizing, similarly, like we're all in a space together to talk about caregiving, um, that you're not alone in feeling tired around this. Just as an example. Sometimes for some people, when self compassion is feels a little bit out of reach, uh, we turn to what Kristen Neff says, that it's about treating yourself as you would a good friend. And so, what I would encourage you to do is if you feel like it is your guilt or one of those belief systems that's getting in the way of your ability to access or engage even a little bit of self care. The question that I'll often ask people to ask themselves is if you had a good friend who was coming to you and describing the exact scenario that you're in to you, what advice would you give them? Because the reality is that more often than not, we treat the people that we care about in our lives with a much more kindness and generosity than we maybe do for ourselves. And sometimes that can help us find where we're getting stuck and have a little bit more access into that self compassion. And so, in terms of self care, I don't think these pieces are things that come as a surprise to anybody. But the first set of things that I'll talk about. So, first and foremost, taking the time that you need for yourself and your own needs. Um, I think there is a real way that, especially um, as certain caregiving might become more complicated or may happen at different times throughout the day or it changes in complexity, this is something that can certainly feel a little bit slippery. And so I think at foundation, acknowledging again that this isn't about only putting yourself first all the time, but it's about including yourself in the care as well. Um, I always personally like to acknowledge the following elements, the acknowledgement that all our bodies need nourishment in the form of food and water. In general, finding some kind of movement tends to be really helpful for us. Um, and sleep in particular, although periods of time for rest and relaxation in general are really important. Part of the reason I always like to highlight those things is that, in a lot of ways, um, our overall ability to function can be highly influenced by each of those things, like just what it takes to get a body moving and energized. I think that many of us have probably had the experience of knowing what it's like to work through a day when we're a little bit sleep deprived, or even working through moments when we're a little hangry. And so, just an acknowledgement of those things, these are really foundational to that. The next set of concepts around self care, I think, are more around sort of beliefs and expectations and how we approach the caregiving tasks that we have or move forward. And so I wanted to offer these that it is normal, I think, particularly in times of stress, and for humans in general, for us to like rehearse the past or rehash the past and rehearse the future and kind of be in this anticipatory space. I think that only increases when we're managing something like care. And so sometimes anchoring ourselves into the present and recognizing what are the things that we can do, and not focusing so much of our attention on the things that we can't um, control. Again, so much easier said than done because it is a normal human thing for us to try to anticipate what's coming. But I just wanted to offer that as a continual practice. Um, with that, being really realistic and intentional about that to-do list. Um, I think there's also, all of these concepts as well, I think can be interwoven with each other. So accepting help if or when it is offered. And I know that that's not always an option for everybody. And it can also be hard to accept help. Um, and to share your feelings with others, certainly friends or family if they are available, or like in this setting of a support group. And part of the reason that I mentioned why these concepts are interwoven is that I think, even in terms of these, like focus on what you can do or what you can control and what's not in your control. Sometimes we really do need outside voices to support us in taking that perspective. It's really hard to do, I think, when you are on your own. And so, certainly, when we're talking about the care of a beloved companion animal, there are perhaps folks who are more intimately in your life, like friends or family, who can perhaps provide that balanced perspective. But that's also something that your veterinary team is there to do as well. And so sometimes I think we think of support as sometimes the closest folks to us, but I think it's also important to see these kind of different layers and potentials in which support can exist around us as well. And so that's the extent of the content that I have. It was a pretty quick brush through, but I'm hoping that if anything else, that it will serve as a gentle reminder to again include yourself in the care that you are giving. Um, because you are important and you matter too. Um, and I think it's important to like, again, uh, I like this be realistic with your to-do list, but I also think it's important to acknowledge all of the hard work that you're doing as well.